So we'll take questions for any of our speakers. If you could just direct who you want me to ask the question to, but you're welcome to ask any of our speakers about any of the topics they've discussed today. If you just raise your hands, we'll try and pass the microphone around as smoothly as we can.
So, Amy, can I start? Marinka, as you heard at the beginning, many of the audience are running tomorrow, and many of the audience work with athletes, work with runners in their clinic. And I wonder if you could tell us your top tips that you give to your athletes or to your clinicians about reducing their risk of injuries, particularly as you showed that there were some studies which had some effect on reducing injuries, whilst others were less effective.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to start with, actually. Well, what we see in all studies and among literature is that once you have had an injury, an athlete has had an injury, you're at higher risk. So that is an alarm symptom to keep an eye on. And I must be honest that the acute chronic workload ratio, I'm not a clinician myself, but I closely collaborate with sports physicians. And I know they use it and they find it very helpful also to look back, like what do you actually do? And what rest do you take, like the rest in between your training sessions. I think that is really important. So I think it is really important to look at the training load, but it's not the only factor. Other factors of which we think is really important, like the other things you do next to running. It's really important to do other sports, to do some strengthening, but also maybe cycling, like I do, or play some other sports. So not only running. I think that is another one as well. So it's the rest and keep an eye on the pain. So there are a lot of runners, what we see is they stick to a training schedule, but you have to have some flexibility. If you're not feeling well, if you're in pain, like slow down, take it easy, take a rest for a week or so and start. And do not start your schedule on then where you lost it, but go back a week and pick it up again. I think that's a mistake we often see, and that's maybe a tip. Thank you.
Hi, I'd first like to say thank you to all the speakers. My question's for Professor Barry Smith, and I was just wondering, so the Strava data is very rich, and it also tells you about elevation. I just wanted to know if you've looked at any correlation with elevation that the runners are running, and if it has any impact on their marathon times or anything else.
Yeah, that's a good question. So does elevation impact marathon times? We have elevation data. We haven't looked at that question directly, but I think intuitively, I'm sure there is an impact. So we use grade-adjusted pacing, which adjusts pacing according to the elevation. But it would be interesting to look at race times for hillier courses, for example, and the relationship with training. So do athletes running those hillier courses train on similar elevations? So that's kind of looking at the amount of ascent and descent. And then I guess you're probably also asking about athletes that train high and race low, for instance. So that's another aspect. There's so much data in the data set that we have from Strava that we're still struggling to work through it. So there's still a lot of open questions that we believe we can answer, but potentially there is information in the data set that could help us with that.
Hello, I have a question for Alba. I just wanted to ask you about plant-based milks as opposed to dairy cow's milk. With regards to the sustainability, that's my first question. And the second question, just sort of linking with that, is if one wanted to find out about a particular food, is there a good place reliable place to look for this information? Because there is obviously so much bias, from different voices, different opinions and places about, sustainability of various foods.
Yeah. So on the first question, there is a paper published last year from one person from my team, Ashley Green. She just looked at that, dairy milk and alternatives. And she found the environmental impact in almost all categories was lower for the plant-based milks, except for example, water use. Sometimes it's higher, especially some of the nuts require higher water inputs. So for that impact category was higher, some milks. And what she found nutritionally, which is very important, it's not equivalent. And for milks, but especially for cheeses and yogurts, it's really a very different nutrient profile. In the case of milks, a lot of them had a supplement of vitamin B12, which makes it a bit better, but I think it's important to ensure that the nutrition that you don't get from some of these milks are are supplemented somewhere else with other foods. But it's a very nice paper to look at. And then the other thing is a good calculator or a good tool, easy to use for that. I'm thinking about it. It's a bit difficult to point you to one, I have to say, because sometimes it's difficult to know what's the background data on those tools. So maybe they are only looking to the production phase and not to the end up of the product. And sometimes it's mixed products. There is one that it's available. It's from the French government. It's called AgriBalise. This is open for everyone. They have quite good data, lead from scientists, and it matches the French nutrition data composition. So it's kind of linked to the nutrition and the environmental data. This is AgriBalise. It's brightened with AgriBalise, how it sounds. Yes, and it's open-based. So however, it's not a calculator. It gives you, for each food, for 100 grams or for 1 kilo of that food, the environmental impact in different impact categories. So I will go there if I had to choose one.
Thank you. For Javier, what's the role of continuous glucose monitoring, perhaps in your research, or informing either elite athletes or the slightly more average amongst us in our training? Are they worth buying? Shall I spend my money, I suppose?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, yes, can we use continuous glucose monitors for training or racing for either the recreational or the elite athlete? I guess one thing to bear in mind is continuous glucose monitors provide a crude estimate of blood glucose concentrations. So they're not actually measuring concentrations in the blood. They measure concentrations in the interstitial fluid, the fluid bathing our cells. And so they need to add in an algorithm to estimate what's going on in the blood glucose concentration. So it's never going to be perfectly accurate, but that degree of imprecision, whether that matters or not, depends on who you are and what your goals are. So for example, if you have diabetes and you've got a large range in your blood glucose concentrations across a day, then a small amount of error in the measurement isn't quite so important. That's okay, you can work with that. But in people who don't have diabetes, then the degree of error becomes problematic because our blood glucose concentrations remain in a relatively tight range. The other potential issue with using them, at least in competition, is that by the time your blood glucose concentrations are dropping, it's probably already too late to correct that with fueling. So to use it in competition as a guide for fueling probably isn't the way forward, even if it can provide accurate measurements. But I think there are still some potential use cases, probably more in training. So one of the examples is that when you do high-intensity efforts or intervals, that adrenaline response can stimulate liver glucose output. So you can get a spike in blood glucose concentrations when you do hard efforts. If your liver is starting to become depleted of glycogen, then that spike will become smaller. And we have used it in that kind of scenario in professional cyclists. So I think it can provide some insight into the underlying physiology of an athlete, maybe in their training. But I don't think it can really provide guidance on a fueling strategy because you're fueling for the next 30 minutes, 60 minutes in your event already, rather than based on what's happened previously. Thanks for the question. I think I've also just spotted the first author of a paper I mentioned earlier in the audience. Is that James Barber over there? So when I mentioned the only study that has compared glucose fructose with glucose only during running, that was run by James Barber. So if you've got questions about that study, I'm sure he'd take them afterwards.
Hi. My question is, I don't really know who to direct it to, so I will let you guys decide. It's probably more in the field of low energy availability, but it's to do with the longevity space. So in some research, it indicates that if you are in a slight low intake, so by like 150, 200 calories roughly, based on what you read, that can help support longevity. However, if you have an athlete that's also trying to achieve that, what do you do?
All right. There's just to put things in context, and one of the reasons why I think I'm just gonna go a little bit around it so I can say something. Energy deficit is one of the few proven strategies to increase lifespan in the majority of species where it has been studied, from like tapeworms to mammals and so on. There hasn't been. It's quite difficult to study in humans, so there's no real evidence to prove that that actually is the case. But most of the data on different animal models support that idea, and one of the reasons why I think also the sort of fear on like low energy availability is a bit exaggerated is also because there seems to be a lot of positive health benefits of at least a degree of energy deficit. When it comes to incorporating that on what an athlete does in their like day-to-day life, I think that becomes really complicated, particularly when you're like talking about a couple of hundred calories a day that you're trying to achieve. So first of all, I don't think we have at least at this point like direct evidence that it's gonna have any positive effect on the health span of the athlete, potentially. But then it's like, that's very small margin to be able to actually incorporate as practice, in my point of view. I think that, it's a quite complicated topic to investigate. When you think about the longest study that has tried to control diet in humans is the calorie study done in the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, and that study lasted for like 2 years duration. So, and there's no non-athletic population, so it's hard to draw conclusions from that. But I would be careful with athletes, and this is sort of on the back of my presentation, is that particularly when you're working with elite endurance athletes or any endurance athlete, really like everyone wants to be lighter than they are. And I think that's one of the problems that we have, is that people maybe focus too much on trying to be lighter. And that's when the problems arise. And then that's again of considering it as a stressor. And when we think about that, we just have to keep in mind that maybe people are not really having enough rest from that stress, and that's when problems arise. So my recommendation would be, more than focusing on that maybe very marginal gain that you might get from those couple of hundred calories difference, that might make you put a lot of attention in something that's not going to have too much of a return in terms of like performance of health. Make sure that all the pillars are in place.
Thank you. Simple question for Dr. Gonzalez. If you were running the marathon tomorrow, at what time would you take your dual fuel gel, your first gel?
I am planning on running tomorrow, and I'll be taking gels approximately every 30 minutes right from the start. So again, there are studies that have looked at frequency of ingesting, and just in general, frequent and often from the beginning. The idea being that you're getting carbohydrate in early and often, and you're trying to spare the glycogen whilst stimulating carbohydrate oxidation and availability.
And so the question for Dr. Alba, for those athletes that are wanting to increase sort of more of a vegetarian or vegan diet, but struggle with more IBS symptoms and do struggle with fructans and the GOSs, is there a way to increase their tolerance so that they're able to eat more beans and legumes?
Sorry, which symptoms you said they struggle with?
So more IBS-like symptoms, so the digestive symptoms that you described, and wanting to increase legumes and beans. Is there a way, or how do you advise them to go about doing that?
So I think one thing is to keep in mind where we have to increase those products. So of course, maybe not before a run or in some very specific moments. So really timing very well with those moments that you know your GI system will be rested and you will have time to digest it. So I will not take that before a marathon, of course, but during the training period, thinking about that. The other thing is that we know that we have, for example, as I said before, soaking legumes, fermenting a bit, boiling very well. So we have some strategies that increase the digestibility of these products and as a consequence decreases the GI problems. This is practice knowledge. We don't have a lot of studies. We have some studies coming up with the digestibility and absorption rates and even amino acid bioavailability when doing fermentation or doing some process. However, it's very difficult when you do these studies on the lab and then you have to do it at home, cooking at different rates, different temperatures with your pot. So it really changes a little bit. Then we know that, for example, I think there are some products that are already available that has a good protein content for plant-based protein content, such tofu or some other processed products. With these, normally they are digestible easily. We have to be a bit careful with the processed products if they have a lot of additives or salt or things like that. But if it's really only extruded protein, it can be a very good alternative for those who really struggle highly with that. And I will say then, I will never put a lot of products on the same plate, a lot of ingredients that are GI sensitive. So I don't know, I'm not going to do a cauliflower and broccoli with some beans and then a green salad on the side. So being very mindful of the quantities of the putting of products that are a bit more difficult to digest in that meal. I don't know if that helped.
Hi, thank you. My question's directed at Alba, if that's okay. Just with regards to those glucose packets that Javier is going to be running with tomorrow, are there any sort of sustainable ways that companies could be looking at developing to make those products?
Yeah, so generally packaging, when we look at the food chain, as I showed at the beginning of a food product, packaging has a, depending on the type of packaging, but in general, lower environmental impact in the sense that it's not a phase of the production that has a high environmental impact. However, in products such as, for example, in this case, sugar, it has quite a considerable impact of packaging. There are some companies, and I don't know if you saw it on the Excel venue when you went to pick your numbers, they have a UK company, for example, now developing bars that they don't have any packaging. It's the beeswax across, and it's eatable. So you just take the bar and eat everything, the packaging included. So of course there is some innovation about it. I just took a sample, so I have it in my purse. If somebody didn't see it and wanted to see it or try it, I'm happy to give it away. But for example, there are some initiatives and things trying to think about that. It's true that when we talk about the competition, it's difficult sometimes. We have to be practical. So sometimes we have to go with these packagings. But I would say when we are training, that it's the majority of the time, then we have to be a bit more mindful. Now there are some companies, gel companies, that they do bulk. So you can buy kind of bulk and do it in your unit when you go training. You just fill it up, and then you clean it, and then you can fill it up again. So I think things are coming, maybe not for the competition day, but for all the rest of the days of the year. So.
And yeah, maybe just to add to that as well, because I completely agree with everything you said there. And I think in training, it's a good opportunity to use things that might be bulkier that you wouldn't necessarily take on race. And of course, nature has its own glucose fructose self-packaged gel, which would be a banana. A great source where the peel itself will compost down, and it provides some electrolytes as well. So yeah, I think there are great options for training.
Okay. Thank you all for the amazing talks. I have two questions, one regarding the pyramidal training and one regarding the injury prevention. So, Prof. Barry, did you find any weekly mileage point in which adding more volume has no longer improved the marathon performance for recreational runners? And I will ask the second question. What do you think is, in your opinion, the most modifiable risk factor that will help prevent injury the most among recreational runners?
Sorry, I didn't get the first question. I think that was for me.
So is there any weekly mileage point beyond adding more volume has no benefit in the marathon performance from the data?
So is there a point at which of diminishing returns in terms of adding more volume? I suspect there is. Didn't see it yet, but I suspect there is. You know, we saw for elite runners, I think they were topping out at around 100 kilometers, a little bit more per week. But you know, common sense, I suppose, at some level dictates that there's diminishing returns there. So we just didn't find it, though. And then was this the second one?
Yeah, the second one, if I understood it well, it's hard to understand everyone from. Yeah. But it's about the most important modifiable risk factor, right? That sort of was the question. Well, I already said, like, the non-modifiable one, and it is modifiable one, of course, is the first injury you get. Because if you haven't had an injury, that's the highest risk factor for getting another one. And in that way, that should be a modifiable one, but we don't know yet. Like how does that first one occur? And then I think if we look at literature, and there have many studies been done in recreational runners, they all do find some association in training load. But some say, like, do not. I think there is one sort of cutoff that has been found in different studies. It's like if you run more than 65 kilometers a week, then you're definitely at higher risk. So that is a modifiable one. But I just heard that you should go to 100. So that's already like. Yeah, it's about. But for example, experience, like running experience, is also a factor, and these of course interact. Because I was also wondering in your data, like, what is the association with your experience in that? So how much can your body handle at a certain moment? And there you also get like the healthy survivors, right? Who can handle all these kilometers and survive and keep on running. So, yeah.
Thanks. A question for Javier, please. Is it possible for a professional athlete, be that a cyclist or a marathon runner, who has such efficient heart rate zones that they could run a whole marathon just on a zone 1, zone 2 fat burning without ever having to utilize carbohydrate?
Yeah, good question. So you can fat adapt by going on a low carbohydrate diet and increase that capacity to burn fat as a fuel. When that's been done in Olympic level race walkers are probably the best population that have been studied for this. The maximum rate of fat oxidation that's seen is about 1.5 grams of fat per minute. If you translate that into running speed or power output, I've done it for power output, I need to do it for running speed for an athlete, then it's something like 240 watts, which isn't enough to fully sustain the marathon at the kind of world record pace. But in theory, if that athlete also has high glycogen stores when they start the marathon, they could do it without taking on board any other carbohydrate. Theoretically, if that actually happens in practice, is questionable. Did that answer your question?
It was more to do, could they do it without ever having to kick in their natural sort of glycogen usage, so that everything is such low level? If you take someone like in the Tour, like Pogacar, whose zone 1, 2 could be like a an amateur athlete, zone 5.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know, his rest days are like 300 watts.
Yeah, yeah. So at those, the low relative intensity for that athlete, they will be using predominantly fat as a fuel, but there's even in at like that 40% power max that I showed, the very first exercise intensity, there's still some muscle glycogen being used. It's just a small amount and ramps up very rapidly. So it seems like we'll always be using some carbohydrate even at the very low exercise intensities.
Probably got time for one more question. Any takers? No, perfect. If you could just give a final round of applause to all our speakers.